Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Paul Martineau, curator of photographs in the Department of Photographs at the Getty Museum and curator of the exhibition Imogen Cunningham, a Retrospective. For those of you who have not seen the show yet, it begins in 1910, the year that Cunningham established her own portrait studio in Seattle, and ends in 1975 in San Francisco with photographs she made of people of advanced age for her book, After 90. When working on this project, three key points became clear to me. Cunningham's decision to become a photographer in 1906 was a daring choice for a woman, especially for one from meager circumstances. The field was dominated by men, many of whom saw the complexity and physical demands of photography beyond the abilities of most women. Undaunted, Cunningham blazed a trail that helped smooth the way for generations of female photographers. Over the course of a career that spanned 70 years, Cunningham's photographs demonstrate her intense engagements with stylistic movements such as pictorialism, modernism, genres such as portraiture, still life and the nude, and street photography, as well as themes such as hands, botanicals, and dancers, among others. Cunningham was a pacifist, and her enlightened attitude about her place in the world extended to her relationships with people of different racial backgrounds and sexual orientations. This helped to break down social barriers while enriching her oeuvre. In 1961, she was recognized by the Urban League of San Francisco for the multiracial character of her photographs. In 1950, Cunningham met the Japanese-American sculptor Ruth Osawa, and despite their 43-year-old age difference, the two artists quickly developed an unbreakable bond based in part on their shared belief that they should not have to choose between family life and their art. Today, Meg Partridge, Cunningham's granddaughter and director of the Imogen Cunningham Trust, joins Addie Lanier, daughter of Ruth Osawa, and Daniel Cornell, curator and author of The Sculpture of Ruth Osawa, Contours in the Air, to talk about how these artists navigated art and motherhood. Moderated by the Los Angeles-based author and performer Sandra Singh Loh, the panel will discuss how these artists became friends, the difficulties they faced as women artists, and the creative strategies they employed to succeed in a male-dominated art world. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Welcome, oh brave people, braving the end of COVID to come here today. Welcome, we're really happy to have you. This is going to be an incredibly exciting and fast-moving hour. So just to let you know what's going to happen, at first we're going to have each of our panelists say a few introductory opening remarks to set the table, if you will. They'll converse, and then the last 15 minutes we'll take questions from you, both in this hall. You can just come up to either of the two mics, and we're getting some questions for you. Hello, people on the World Wide Web that will be coming in, floating through the ether to us. And then afterwards, Paul, I think you're going to be out in front so that people can chat with you and visit, et cetera. Okay, so thank you for being here. So We'll begin with you, Danielle. Okay, well, I mean, prior to helming the Palm Springs Art Museum for much of the last decade, which is an amazing facility, you were director of contemporary art projects at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, which is there where you met in San Francisco Ruth Asawa and became involved in her work. Can you just give us a snapshot of what that was like meeting her for the first time and working with her on these great installations?
Sure. Well, I was hired in 2000 when the De Young was being rebuilt with a brand new contemporary museum by Herzog and de Meuron. And the director was talking to the curators about what the various programs would be and what would be in this new building, which is very exciting for the city and for all of us. And we were tossing out some ideas about some of the contemporary artists who would do installations, because the idea was to put installations throughout the museum of contemporary art so that that would be a touchstone no matter what part of the collection you were looking at. And as we were talking about various artists, he mentioned Ruth Asawa. And I have to confess that even though having a PhD in art history and critical theory and studying in New York at a very prominent university, I'd never heard of this artist. And so I said, who's this? And Harry Parker, who was the director, who had come out of education at the Met, said, oh, if you have not met Ruth, you are in for a treat. And so I said, well, okay, and a bit skeptical because I was thinking about these places in the museum that would be prominent places for prominent artists. And so I had an interview, I had an appointment and went to meet Ruth about the possibility of doing an installation at the new museum. And I walked into the house on Saturn Street, which had been a cottage and it had been remodeled by her husband, architect Albert Lanier. And I walked into the living room, and hanging from the rafters, because it was kind of an A-frame raftered ceiling, hanging from the rafters were just multitude of sculptures of these hanging pendulous forms, and all around the room were these tied wire plant-like forms of sculptures, and I felt like I'd entered into an entirely different world. I felt like I was on an enchanted planet. And so I looked at this work, and there was Ruth waiting to talk to me. And as I began to talk to her, I realized that this really had to happen at the De Young, and that the director was right. And so from there, we began to talk about where this could happen. And because Ruth had such a strong passion for public education, we decided that it would make the most sense for an installation of her work, much like you felt when you walked into her home, to occupy the ground floor or the lobby of the education tower of the building. And so that's how I met her, and she was very excited about that idea. And as a matter of fact, there's some pictures here of it. That's part of it. And you can see how it feels like a very immersive environment, something that you would move through and experience the sculptures and their shadows. Here's another view of another part of the tower. You can see how inventive she was. That was one thing that struck me right away. Even though the work is based on two very simple principles, one of looping and another one of tying and dividing, the amount of variation is endless. And that was very much a part of her and who she was, and the way that she saw art as problem solving, and why she thought it was so important and so fundamental to people in terms of their education. She believed art was the foundation of education because it taught you to problem solve in a creative way. This was a corner of the installation, and just to give you a little insight into Ruth and her sly sense of humor, that's 3 sculptures that are hanging together in a group, as she often would group them. And at the very end, when the installation was all done and she came to see it installed, she looked at that group of sculptures and she looked up at me and she said, "I thought I only gave you 3 of those sculptures." And that's just so typical of the way that she understood how these sculptures would work together, and also in terms of the transparency and the way that their forms would then be projected onto the wall and the surroundings around them.
And can you talk a little bit about botanicals, her work in botanicals and nature and plants?
Sure.
Inspiration.
So Ruth was always interested in organic forms and in plant life, and I think she shared that with Imogen. I think we'll see that a little bit later when we talk about Imogen. But this actually was the first tied wire sculpture, this tied and branching sculpture form that she created, that she did in 1961. And she did this because a friend of hers, and you're going to have to remind me who the friend was.
Paul Hassel, the photographer.
Yes, Paul Hassel. Thank you. Brought back a desert plant for her and said, "You love to draw, so here, draw this interesting plant." And she said that she tried to draw it and she just couldn't get it right. And so she decided that she was going to have to create it as a sculpture to understand how to draw it. And so that was the first tied wire experiment that she had. And again, that goes along with this notion of problem solving and thinking about ways that you can be creative at making something, in this case, a plant, become a sculpture and then ultimately drawing. I have a few more images of the way that she continually experimented and worked with plant forms, and especially in drawings and prints and lithographs. This is a drawing, and this actually started with her training under Albert, what's his first name?
Joseph.
Joseph.
Joseph Allers, yeah.
I just have a degree in art history. So I started with Joseph Albers at Black Mountain, where she studied with him, and he really emphasized the importance of everyday materials. Thank you.
See, everyday materials, not mics that we lit on the head. Everyday, yes.
Yeah, where he emphasized them working with everyday materials and not wasting everything, making everything count, but also thinking about the way that nature itself can be translated into abstract art. And so this is a leaf study of dogwood leaves, which were all over the campus at Black Mountain College. This is oil and watercolor. Here's another oil and watercolor on paper that she did. And you begin to see her interest in this layering and transparency here that later, and the chaining that later shows up in her lobed forms. That these are birds taken to an abstract level. It's very Escher-like in the way that she's playing with foreground and background and what is inside and outside. All of these things which become preoccupations in her sculpture later on. These are actually the plane trees, which are in the plaza right outside in front of the De Young, and she did this as a series of lithographs. Capturing the nature, the elemental quality of this natural growth in the Golden Gate Park. Golden Gate Park. Here's a magnolia, and if you go to the exhibition, you'll see Imogen's most famous image of the magnolia, but you can see that Ruth was also interested in that flower and its form. This is another lithograph, but again, a desert plant, which she's experimenting with lithograph and how to present with this wonderful star in the middle of this plant form. This, again, ink and paint on bark paper. So taking actually a part of the plant and making it the ground with which then she represents the form of the plant itself. Really beautiful. So those are some of the ways in which she really had this very strong interest in plants and organic forms, and because most people know the sculptures, I thought it'd be instructive to see that she was very interested in that work in drawing and painting and lithographs as well.
Yes, it's really extraordinary to see these. And I'm just going to say again, think about the questions that you'll be asking shortly. We are having questions coming in from the web, which I'll pose and let float out there as we continue to speak, because I know there's a wealth of material coming. People on the web want to know, did Imogen and Ruth ever collaborate on an artwork project, which I think we'll be seeing some more. Yeah, now we've set the table with Ruth, and we're going to be seeing what's coming next. And how did Imogen and Ruth first meet? Okay, so Addie, let's go to you next, now that you're stewing in all these questions. For the last 2 decades with your sister Aiko Kunio, you've built an extraordinary archive of your mother's work and making it available for curators, et cetera, to share with the public. In addition, you worked on some of her public commissions when you were younger, in addition to being a grants manager and public school teacher. But of course, you're the youngest daughter of Ruth, and so no one more than you has a better perspective, personally, eye to eye, of what the relationship was like between Ruth and Imogen.
Yes, well, I was forced to clean Imogen's house as a teenager.
That's about as intimate as you can get.
My mother made me, as a senior in high school, take the bus across town and clean Imogen's house. And the thing that is shocking to me about this is, I mean, I grew up with Imogen. Imogen did my baby book. She went on our field trips to Cronkite Beach. She came for dinner often, bringing Swenson's lemon chiffon ice cream. There was this, Imogen was around quite a bit, and my parents loved her as an older woman. She was quite a bit older than my mother. My mother was 24 years old, a new mother, a very accomplished artist, but not one that was well known, when she met Imogen. And Imogen was, I think, 68 years old at the time she met my mother. And they made this kind of immediate bond. They just loved each other. And Imogen shared the same birthday with my father. So my father's birthday and Imogen's birthday was celebrated together pretty much my whole life. And so Imogen's son, Ron, was a photographer of he did architectural work. My father was a draftsman in an architect's office. And Ron, told my father, I've got a mother you should meet. And the way he introduced her, a mother you should meet. And they became friends from that point forward. So this picture that you see right here is what I think is the earliest portrait of my mother by Imogen. And the funny thing about Imogen, I guess, is one of the things is that she dated her photographs when she printed them, not necessarily when she took them. So you can have one print of Imogen, and there's going to be all these multiple dates on it. And so we had to do research to try and figure out, well, when was this picture taken? And it turns out that this sculpture was a sculpture that my mother submitted to the San Francisco Art Association in 1950 for inclusion in a juried show. And she got a letter stating that she had been accepted for exhibition. So when she called to talk to the people about the show, they said, "Oh, forgive us, you were actually rejected." And the reason why, she asked, well, why was I rejected? I got an acceptance letter. And the reason why she was rejected is because, number one, they said they thought it was maybe more like craft than art. And number two, it was that it wasn't on a pedestal, it wasn't seated on anything. So they didn't consider it sculpture. So she appealed, and they eventually reversed their initial decision and they accepted the show. But it was Imogen who told my mother that my mother had submitted the sculpture as Ruth Lanier, which is her married name. And Imogen told my mother, "You should use your maiden name. You don't look like a Lanier. Be Ruth Asawa." And so she'd already exhibited in college as Ruth Asawa, so she took Imogen's advice. So in some way, Imogen was this kind of much older, more experienced. She'd supported herself for many years as a working artist, and she was very much a mentor to my mother. And Danielle, when he came to our house to unpack my mother's archive for the show in 2006, one of the major things he looked at were these portraits of my mother by Imogen that had lived in manila folders in a dresser, and none of us had ever seen it. And so all of these portraits that are now pretty well known and that have really pushed my mother's career was kind of started when Danielle saw, oh my God, all these Imogen portraits. So Imogen really, their friendship has extended beyond their lives, and Imogen's portraits of my mother have promoted her career, and my mother's, I guess my mother's prominence out, these are Imogen Cunningham portraits, have kind of fed back into renewed interest in Imogen. So they're still in cahoots, even though they're both gone. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I just want to interject that when I first went to the house, the sculptures were amazing, the environment was amazing. But when I started actually working with all the banker's boxes and the dresser drawers and everything, which was tucked away in corners and everywhere, all of that stuff, Addie and her sister Aiko just were tireless in bringing out boxes and opening up things, and so generous in terms of what you did. And over the years have really made that archive accessible to people, and it's really a testament to you and Aiko that people have this wonderful archive of material now to research.
Well, thank you. And the funny thing is my parents, as just telling Meg, my parents held up the idea of the Imogen Cunningham Trust as something that we should do as their children, because the Imogen Cunningham Trust was preserving the work of Imogen and keeping it in the public and curatorial eye and everything. And we said, but Mom, she was a photographer. Those are negatives you can reprint. You're an artist. You have one uniques. We can't really do that. But it's kind of turned on where we've kind of built the archive, a different kind of an archive, but something similar kind of to the trust. And one of the things I was going back, why I selected this image to show you, is not only is the story about how my mother and Imogen were very overlooked as artists because of their being women, but also Imogen took this same picture on the same day. And this is my mother with my older sister Aiko, my older brother Xavier. And the only reason why we can date this sculpture is because of the age of the kids, because there was nothing written. So this kind of communal life, the life it feeds back and forth. My mother drew Imogen, just as Imogen photographed Ruth, and so there might be, varying quality, upwards of 200 sketches, drawings of Imogen by my mother. These are Imogen's hands. This is Imogen photographing at Cronkite Beach, and she's got to be in her 80s, and she's hiking up to the military battlements to take pictures of us on that day. It's quite staggering that she was that old and that able. And we just wanted to give you a couple very funny portraits of Imogen. And she always wore the peace sign during the protest. And this is just a portrait of the two of them at a dedication of one of my mother's public commissions. So that's my section. Oops. And I'm going to pass it over.
Yes, and Meg, last but not least, you're of course the director of the Imogen Cunningham Trust, which was started in 1975 by your grandmother, and you're also a cinematographer and filmmaker who's done films on Imogen Cunningham, and your godmother Dorothea Lange, and of course your father Rondell Partridge. So when I was Googling all the wonderful clips and photos and whatever, of course on the Google search, one of the first things that pops up is Imogen Cunningham killing it on the Johnny Carson show. And she is, I think it's almost the last year of her life. I don't remember how old she is, and she is so funny. And I think these caricatures immediately, like you were saying, like Imogen could be a tough customer with others. She said it how it was, and these images are hilarious, and she was hilarious on that show. But of course, do you remember that? And of course, she had a view of celebrity versus artistry that was that those were distinct.
Yes, indeed. I don't remember how it came to be that she was invited on the Johnny Carson show, but I do remember I was just watching it from my house, and I remember thinking, oh, what's she going to do next? Because, it was always predictably unpredictable. And what she did is she spent most of her time with the guests as opposed to Johnny Carson, speaking to the guests. And when Johnny Carson, of course, asked, well, do you watch my show? And she sort of shyly said, well, I fall asleep with your show. So that was typical of Imogen. And Imogen had a very public persona that was very sharp and witty and honest. And you couldn't get away with anything with Imogen, even in her family as a kid. But there was also a very interested aspect of Imogen's kind of focus on what you were doing and how you were doing it and what you were thinking. She was always interested in young people and what they thought. And so I think that's so much about why she was attracted to this relationship with Ruth, and it was a vital, vital creative relationship. And in terms of the work that they did, this is one of my favorite images of Ruth's sculptures. But Addie, you can speak to this as to why perhaps it came to be.
Well, I believe this photograph is part of an application for Guggenheim grant. And over the years, as we've tried to get more and more information on these photographs, because both people who know about them are gone, this photograph, I think, is capturing the concept of continuous form within a form that my mother had just kind of mastered. And these are various examples of, on the single lobe on the right, and then there's a four lobe on the left, and this is her signature design. And she's called up Imogen and said, hey, could you come and take some pictures for me? Not only did she need it for the Guggenheim, but she needed her to document that she'd had a breakthrough. And Imogen comes over and does this for her.
Right.
And what's interesting for me, looking at these also as photographs, nobody had a big, beautiful studio with backdrops. I think this is like a sheet in the back. And that white is beyond the back of the sheet. So as you can see in this one, which reflects a different form, which is Addie.
It's the open window form, and she shot it in a window.
In an open window.
So there's a humor there that people may or may not know.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was constructed due to, at least in part, because of their environment. They didn't have impressive big studios. They didn't haul this downtown to put in an installation space. They just did it with what they had, which I think is really wonderful. And I have a series of photographs of Ruth working just because I think it's so expressive of their relationship, because Imogen was brutally honest, to say the least. And if she liked people, you just saw how she was gravitated toward them and toward their work and toward what they were trying to express and show and accomplish. And I think Imogen did that beautifully with Ruth and the work. And I have to say, I don't think I ever saw Imogen leave the house without a camera. She was a photographer's photographer. You know, she photographed anything that she was interested in, and all of her work with Ruth was primarily done in the house and in their trips together as they went around town. But we're left with this fabulous documentation of Ruth's process that we're really lucky to have, because not only are they just beautiful photographs, but you can see the youth of Ruth and how incredible her work is.
Well, and I think also the focus on the work that both of these women, I think you've said, it's about the work, again, not necessarily the career. They had to, as women, you know, have unique challenges in terms of making an artistic career in a male-dominated world, but the work was really important. I wonder if you would share, there's a funny Ansel Adams anecdote that if you don't mind sharing that. And I feel like they would have sat at the dinner table and gossiped about other photographers,
Yeah.
and this would be a nugget.
Well, Ansel, of course, Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Imogen, they were all, Sonina Skoviak, others, were all a part of the F-64 group in the early 1930s. And the motivation for that was, at least in good part, to get more exposure toward their work and photography in the art world, which they accomplished. But Ansel was very precise and clear about his determination to show his work in a very pristine manner. And in later years, he had a Folgers coffee contract to put one of his photographs on the Folgers coffee coffee can. And I remember I was a teenager, and like Addie, I needed some money as a teenager, and so I went to Imogen's house a few times a week as a teenager to spot prints. And it's a tiny sort of aspect of a finishing of a photograph that you need young eyes for. And I would be working in her dining room, which was also her kitchen, which was also her bedroom, because she preserved most of her space for her workspace. And I'd be spotting away just at a photograph, and I'd see Imogen come in and go into the kitchen, which was 5 feet from me, and she opened this coffee can. It's like, okay. Then she pours it out. She was very conservative. Pours it out into another glass jar. And then she goes out into the yard with this coffee can, which had Ansel's image on it, and digs up a marijuana plant that I had been noticing for weeks growing in her garden, on the edge of her garden in San Francisco. I'm thinking she's going to get arrested, right? But she didn't, and she potted it up. And then later that afternoon, a young man came and was going to visit Ansel. And she presented it to this young man to deliver to Ansel. Which he did.
Folgers coffee can with one of his mountain images and a weed plant.
Indeed.
I mean, that,
a little bit of a comment.
yeah, that's like a mic drop right there.
Yeah.
That's,
So this was in her 80s, mind you. So
well, and I think
she had
also
her fun.
that you say in her, and it's such an inspiring tale. I mean, both of them, but Imogen, I think that her age, that she seemed ever useful. You were saying that she was taking a portrait of you. How old was she when you were doing the math on
I
that?
had no idea that she was 91 years old, 90 or 91 years old, when I was cleaning her house. I should have known better. You know? But
Yeah,
there's one afternoon she says, "Stop, take your hair down, I'm going to take your picture." she was on some project with Polaroid to do some kind of experimental negatives. And so she made me do this. She took my picture and then she printed from this Polaroid. So there are these unique prints. But she was 90, and I think it's an amazing portrait.
Yeah.
Pretty stunning. You know,
Yeah, it's inspiring that she's hopping on planes, you're saying, and the Johnny Carson, I think she was in her 90s, that was her last year, and she's just sharp as a tack. And,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and I think there are other photos here that I think also what's inspiring about the relationship, as you say, this friendship that resonates even today, that this wealth of the relationship that you see as they're commenting back and forth on each other is, I think that as women, not only is it about sending Ansel Adams's coffee can with a pre-plan, which is pretty great, but also using the material, just working where they were, right? In the garden with children around. Can you talk a little bit about either the philosophy of just being in family, using what you have, working right there, even
Well,
with these?
I think probably Addie, I think we're both in agreement that they didn't have studios. Neither of these women had studios outside the house when their kids were little, and it was all a part of their life and living. Imogen took massive amounts of photographs of her three children. As she said, she had 3 children in 2 years because she had twins shortly after having Griff, the firstborn. So I think it was just a part of their life that they felt was tremendously important, and they did a fabulous job at it. And it would not have been as easy had they had an external studio space to work
Right,
in.
and just taking those amazing photographs, like of the magnolia one in the backyard, right?
Yeah, so my father was 8 when that photograph was taken. Yeah.
And my mother wrote that Imogen always felt that it was terrible that mothers put a guilt trip on their children. Imogen saying, you're putting a guilt trip on your children if you say that you wanted to be an artist, but you had to give it up because of the children. So what my mother and Imogen figured out how to do was to have work in media that allowed them to continually to develop their eye, their expression, etc., their subject matter, and be fully fulfilled artists and be mothers. It was a hard road. That's not to say it was easy to do. But
Right, and to have wire that you could work with while
wire
kids
that
were
you
around.
could, it didn't matter. There wasn't going to be paint drying out. You weren't going to have lines coming across your watercolors if you, if you had to stop. So when she has these young children, which is 1950 to 1959, she's really doing tons and tons of work in wire. And you pick it up and you take it and you go out into the garden and the kids are running around and you pick it back up and you take it back in the house and then you make dinner. And my sister always says that about her, that my mother was always kind of working around, but the kids are always happening as well.
Yeah, we're
Same
going to see
time.
some images in a moment. And Danielle, because you are our art historian, I mean, could you give a little bit of perspective of even this notion of nature, of making art about nature, that it is both, and I think neither anti-feminist nor feminist, I think that their opinions are very much their own and delightfully fresh. It doesn't hew to either any particular side of just the politics, I guess, of making nature work. Is it female? Is it male? Does it not even matter? Can you talk to them?
Yeah, well, historically, as many people know and have commented, women have been identified with nature within the field of art, to the point that there's even been politically discussions about the fact that women are objectified because, as human beings, we objectify nature in order to control it and manipulate it. And so this alignment has served this very conservative political notion that women and nature are somehow subject to a male perspective. But Asawa and Cunningham both had this wonderful understanding that as women, they could really identify with nature without necessarily falling within some kind of male hierarchy. And so their interest in nature was thinking about nature as a form of empowerment, as a way to explore the world and to find a way to collaborate with the world, rather than to subdue it or to conquer it, but to really collaborate with it and make art together with it. And so I think that was really at the root of the way that they were able to not make peace with, but come to terms with the nature that was around them and available to them, and also to make a comment that as women, we are powerful. We have strength, and we know, especially today in our political situation, that by not acknowledging the power of nature, the power of women, we've gotten ourselves into quite a predicament.
To say the least. Well, thank you. Yeah, so why not, like, please, we're here. That's why we're, and I think that, I mean, you've talked also about Ruth's incredible generosity as a person to yourself and Imogen, like, it seemed they were both interested both in art makers, art people, people and young people, and I think that the notion of gender, not just in nature, but I think even in nude photography, right, about how males versus females were looked at. Do any of you have any thoughts about that of groundbreaking on every level, not just between ethnicities and but also between genders and sexuality? That they both broke a lot of barriers that way.
Well, yeah.
I think Meg could probably speak to that in Imogen's photographs, because of the way that there was kind of an equality of images between men and women. I mean, she was one of the first women who actually treated men the same way that she treated women in her photographs.
Yes, and I think, Imogen, as I remember her, she did not subject her opinion on someone before she knew them. And she certainly did after she knew them. But if they were, young and interesting and older or intriguing, she was interested. And it didn't matter what gender or color or perspective they had. I think probably a conservative political perspective would have stalled her immediately. But other than that, she was interested in hearing what they had to say. And she took on people who were incredibly different in terms of their history and their perspective from her own, because she always wanted to learn more about what they were thinking. She was always very intrigued. And I think that's probably why she was often so interested in younger groups of people. I didn't see her hang out with a lot of people her own age, ever. Yeah.
Yes, Addie?
I have a thought, because I saw the portrait of Mary Rink in the show, the nude, pregnant woman.
Yeah.
Now it's very chic to go and show your baby bump or whatever. But back in 1959, was that done with pendulous breasts, the dark line on the belly because baby's coming due, and she also took portraits. Well, Mary Rank was a friend of my mother's. They were close. So when Imogen would come over to visit, I'm sure Mary and Ruth hung out with Imogen, and they just enjoyed being with each other. And can you imagine saying, a woman who's 9 months pregnant, would you mind taking off your clothes? I'd like to photograph you. Imogen would do that, and Mary acquiesced, and you have this beautiful series of this. I'm also thinking in terms of the nude, we have portraits of one of my brothers as a baby, and it's completely form, It's not the little happy picture of the face. It's the form of the body it's kind of separate from, it's really almost objectified, but they're beautiful portraits of a little baby, but not in the way that you would ever see them in a baby book,
Yeah. We have a couple, okay, we're going to take your questions in just a few minutes, and you can go up to either of these two mics, but they're pouring in from the web, so we'll just kind of, sprinkle in as we go. Cunningham's images are both beautiful and enlightening, providing insight into Asawa's world and artistic process. Is there any other documentation of Asawa's process? Are there any images of Cunningham and Asawa together? If you want.
Well, maybe we can answer that with some slides.
There you go. It's live. That's the beauty of live.
We have a few more of slides of Ruth working, and this is Ruth working in her studio, which was in your basement, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, which I love. It's just process photographs. But we're getting to additional images that Imogen took.
And these are so fantastic to see, I think, in a world where artists are on the Gap or an Apple, and they're always posed in a studio doing something that to see her doing her actual work is
and I think
inspiring.
it really speaks to what their relationship was about. I mean, to have someone just hang out in your studio while you're working. And I love this series because it's Ruth working at a table, and you can see it's kind of like a series if you were to look at the contact sheet and see Imogen's process. But what I wanted to get to is this, which was Imogen took photographs of Ruth in color, and also in a different way, Imogen was interested in photography always with what she personally would be motivated to do with an image. This is a negative, obviously, image, and it comes from a color slide. So Imogen took that color slide into her black and white darkroom and made a negative out of it. So it's really interesting to find how Imogen was always playful photographically, working in the world of photography, and didn't ever limit herself, be it a friend or a formal portrait of Gertrude Stein, to say, oh, I've got it, this is yours, no problem. She's always working for that one other photograph that she was really interested in creating, and very finding an expression that was different from the average expression. And we have a few other photographs. She was fascinated with, she didn't do color a lot, but she was fascinated with bringing some color in. And Ruth's work is great to see in color because...
Can I make a joke?
Yes.
Of course.
This is how you do not handle a Ruth Asawa sculpture. Back in the day, that's what she was doing. You don't do that anymore.
We have some photographs of Ruth's beautiful work, just kind of like wrapped up. You're thinking, you're cringing a little bit, thinking about, ooh, how did that get there?
So what I'm going to do, since we want to use the time that we have with these amazing people, if you have a question, please come up to either of these two mics. We have some coming in from the web, so I'll ask, don't be shy, come up. But they're coming in on the web also. But I'm inviting you to step up. One of the quick ones. It was so hilarious. Was Addie ever put to work to help twist wires for her mom?
I was put to work to help coil for my mom, and I was put to work to hand her ties for her tying, because she was doing these tied wire sculptures, and there would be these little 2-inch pieces for the wire that were going to be ties, and I'd have to hand her 2 at a time, and she'd just be cranking them around. Yeah.
The youngest art assistant, I suppose. Okay, we have a couple more, but here, please say your name if you don't mind, and then ask your question.
Craig Kroll. 2 questions. Well, first, the pictures that Imogen took of Ruth are incredible. I've never seen many of these. If it's not a book, it should be a book. Just that subject alone would be fantastic. But the question I have is, we have the team right here to put the book together. The question I have is, I read that Ruth did not hold a grudge against the U.S. government for being interned, but she also said that it changed her life. So what does that mean, and did she talk about it?
Oh, it's funny you bring that up, because part of the reason why I think Ron thought that Imogen would like meeting Ruth was during the war, Imogen took care of a Japanese friend's belongings while he was interned. So the reason why my mother said about internment was she was 15 when the war started, 16 when she was interned, and she got locked up in Santa Anita Racetrack to live in 2 horse stables with her mother and her siblings. But she got to study with Disney animators up in the grandstands. And it was the first time she ever got to be around a professional artist. And these animators were so generous, trying to create activities for the kids. And then because of the internment, the Quakers gave scholarships to the kids who were locked up in the camps. Wow. She got a scholarship to go to Milwaukee. And then because of racism in Milwaukee, where she couldn't do her student teaching, she went off to Black Mountain, which is where she met Joseph Albers. And she would never have found Joseph Albers had she not been interned, scholarshiped, and then not allowed to finish her teaching degree. So she was very grateful for who she became, and all of those steps were necessary for her, she thinks.
And yes, come on down. Another question. I am not a mother, but an educator, which is like having a 24-hour job. And I think anybody who is an educator, our teachers can, and you've done that as well as can relate. It is difficult to find time and energy to write. Amen. Would you mind going into more detail about Ruth Asawa's daily habits, practices? As a first responder, I find difficulty in finding the emotional, physical energy to settle into a daily practice. And I think that would go for either of these two. What was her daily routine like?
Well, Imogen, I used to work for her, and I got to her place about 10 in the morning, but she'd already been up for 4 hours. So she started in her darkroom, and she's in her 80s. She started in her darkroom printing before anybody else came. She had myself, and she usually had one other more adult assistant who would do more finishing and drive her places and all of that. And that's how she used to say she got most of her work done before 10 in the morning. So that's how she did it. And she would see people in the afternoon and have all of us sort of running in and out in the daytime, and then be conniving and trying to find someone to drive her to the latest museum opening or gallery show because she didn't drive. So she had a busier schedule. I'm sitting there doing my spotting thinking, oh my gosh, she's like busier than I am.
Yes, Addie, did you?
Same thing for Asawa. She was probably an insomniac. She probably got by on about 4 hours of sleep a day. And as I mentioned earlier during the thing, her media, when she had young children, when she had to be on, was something that was stop and start. I think it's very difficult if you are a writer, if you're doing that kind of intellectual, cognitive kind of thing. It's very difficult to be able to stop and start that much. So you have to take what Asawa was able to accomplish by kind of the media that she was working in.
Yeah. Yes.
This is such a great panel, and I thank all of you. But I'm curious both because every time I see Ruth's work and also photographs by Imogen of the work, I think it's so sexy. And sort of constantly flipping between sort of womb-like and erections. And so I wonder, for both artists, did they often have to encounter charges of this is on the border of pornography?
Oh.
Well, I can speak a little bit to Imogen's 1917 work of Roy, her husband, nude, which she took on Mount Rainier, and it was very shortly thereafter posted in a Seattle newspaper, and she was called out to be an immoral woman. And so she didn't pay much mind to it. She used to tell us that story kind of humorously. Many years later, she was given the Guggenheim and she asked to reproduce some of her early work, which, by the way, she kept her glass plate negatives all sandwiched together, wrapped in brown paper, which she used to flatten her prints, and that's how she saved them. But she pulled those out and reprinted those at that time. And I don't think she ever let anything like that just stop her. It gave her pause, perhaps. She would comment on it, but it wouldn't embed itself in her. She just kept on going.
I think Asawa, for me, is more the idea of inside and outside at the same time. And it's the idea of the meander, which is, and it's also reflecting who she was as a human being. She was outside the mainstream. You know, she was always an outsider. Imogen was always an outsider.
Totally.
These women were beyond the norm. So, but for my mother, in terms of the sensuousness of her, especially of her continuous form within a form, you know, the story of that is, it's when she's a child on the back of the tractor, on the leveler, and she's dragging her feet in that fine dirt. And it's going in and out and in and out. And she realizes when she's 1985 that she was doing those as a child. She was doing those forms as a child. So I don't think of her in terms of that. I think her forms are very sensual, but nature is sensual, isn't it? Biomorphic. I mean, isn't that part of your terminology? they're coming from life, right?
They are, but I would agree that there is an element of sexuality that they have injected in addition into the work, especially when you see how many of the images that Imogen took of Ruth rhyme her body and the form. And you can't rhyme something without calling attention to the thing you're rhyming. So when you use, you know, the sculpture, the lobe, and it's rhyming the breast and the neck and the head, you're asking people to pay attention to the head and the neck and the breast. So I think in terms of like what would be called in artistical terms of formal reading of these images, that they were very, very cognizant of the fact that they were making something that was sexual. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I've never thought of it like that, but yeah.
Yeah, and they both were very rigorous in their work too. And that's one thing that I do appreciate about the work, is that they understood that there wasn't a like dichotomy between sensuality and rigor. That those two things were very much supportive of each other.
Can I just make one other comment in relation to Craig Kroll's comment about the internment, and then you're speaking about how she turned this to her advantage, how she saw advantages in this. But it seems to me that the use of metal is also a reminder of incarceration, imprisonment, being closed in, and it seems to me her work is a kind of example, getting back to the peace sign that Imogen wore, of turning swords into plowshares. And then you brought up this earlier agricultural metaphor as well. So just a way of thinking about how the metal resonates in a number of ways.
Can I respond to one thing about my mother's work? Her form is so absolutely beautiful, but there's always a tension there. So I think when you have the whole thing where you have incarceration and you have sensuality and you have all these different ideas, you have a lot of emotional energy that is going into these works. The same thing about Imogen's portraits. There's emotional energy in those things. And whether you call it sexuality or whatever, there's always a tension. And so that is partially what makes them such amazing artists, is that they captured that.
One of the things in my experience of Ruth, which was late in her life, obviously, was how incredibly kind and generous she was. And she always rooted for the person who was the underdog. And so I think in relationship to, and this kind of a guest just from spending time with her and hearing her talk. And she was incredibly supportive of me and my sexuality. And this was a time in San Francisco when Proposition 8 was on the ballot, which was an attempt to deny gays and lesbians any opportunity to form families. And she was very vocal about how incensed she was that this sort of thing would be happening in her beloved San Francisco, of all places. But I think she turned that experience of what we might call being a victim into empathy for other people who were in challenging circumstances. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons that she didn't think of herself as a victim, because she was able to take her experience and use it to understand and empathize with people who were being constrained in other ways.
It's extraordinary. We are going to take a couple of more questions from the web, but we are going to close in just a few minutes. Before we do these last few questions, I just want to remind you that the museum is still open, so you still have time to see the exhibit if you haven't already. So go out and look, and Paul Martineau is going to be out to escort you, answer questions, etc. So thank you. So there's the last couple of questions I'm going to take from the web. I'll say what they all are, and you can pick and choose where you might want to, and either responding to or a final statement that you would. Yes,
To
Addie.
follow up on Danielle's comment, my mother could be very pithy, and she said, racism is just an excuse to hate. And she would say that for like everything. Homophobia is just an excuse to hate. So people are often searching for that so they can get that energy out, but it's really misplaced. Yeah.
So the couple last questions I'm going to take from the web, which was there ever a distinction between work, art making, and family time for either artists or families? You can think about that for a moment. What role do shadows play in each artist's work? I'm looking at you, Danielle. That seems like such a Danielle question. That's kind of okay. And also this one is right to Meg. I would love to know more about how Imogen got her works into the public, or how her work was noticed, and how she approached getting her work seen and exhibited, on top of actually making the art, especially without the internet or social media. Okay.
I'll try to be brief.
Okay, so all right, so okay, so this is your question.
Well, I think Imogen was very astute in the fact that she knew that to get her work out in the world, she had to do and have the discipline of getting it into museums and institutions. And she did that very early on. She had help. People like Edward Weston would help her by asking her to be a part of significant exhibitions. In 1929, she had a Portland Art Museum exhibition early on, Brooklyn. So she was very well aware and capable, important to say, of being able to create museum quality exhibitions and get them out the door. She was always working at that, as well as everything else.
Right. Yes, Addie, what question would you like to ask, or final comment would you like to make?
I don't know. I would just say that.
Well, are you? Yes. Well, for instance, there's a picture here. You're not naked.
I'm not born yet.
You're not born.
Actually, can we take one more? Can we do the thing? I just will say one thing about Imogen and Ruth. I mean, Imogen loved my mother's cooking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
There we go.
And so there's Imogen at the table, my father, my mother, there's us 6 kids. So my mother had to put together dinner for 8 every night.
Oh, my.
And there were often, 1 or 2 people added on. But Imogen and my mother shared a love of Satsuma plum jam. And they would go on outings to go gather these neglected plums from people who didn't have weren't using the plums. And then they would almost be competitive about, this is my jam, and this is my jam. And they would taste each other's jams. I just wanted to say that about, my mother was an amazing cook. Imogen loved coming for dinner. And they loved sharing this kind of the simple things, like making jam. Imogen sewed all her own, mended her own clothes. She was very frugal. She was very modest, as was my mother. And they had that kind of common very simple upbringing that was, that they appreciated. No, no fuss, no muss. Don't put on airs, you know.
Yeah, there seems
Yeah.
to be such a joy of making things,
Yeah.
if it's a plum jam or a sculpture.
Yeah, and so for example, on this one too, is Imogen didn't drive. So if my parents were going out into the country, they would invite Imogen to come along. And so this sculpture that's hanging from the tree was a sculpture that my mother traded with the jeweler Margaret DePata for a pin. And they took Imogen along, and so Imogen took a portrait of my brother Xavier holding the globe with the tree, the sculpture hanging from the tree in the background. And it's that kind of organic, fun, but they're all enjoying themselves. And they're hanging out with other artists, and so it's all very happy.
Nature,
Yeah.
nature, and nature.
Yep.
And Danielle,
I think that's a great anecdote to end on.
well said, well said. Well, thank you so very much. If you could give a hand for our great panelists, Danielle, Addie, and Meg, and to the Getty for putting on this great conversation. Again, we encourage you to go and look at the exhibit. And Paul will be there. And again, thank you so much for your time of sharing this incredible.
Thank you for
Well, thank you for moderating.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
pleasure. Thank you.